morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much for your ongoing viewership and support. If you're enjoying these live streams and want to help us keep them going, please stay tuned to the end of this broadcast to find out an easy way that you can make a donation. And be sure to check out our website at lawac.org to see a terrific lineup of live streams, including a new 2020 presidential series beginning September 8th. It's now my pleasure to introduce politics professor Dan Schnur and Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, a wonderful weekly series that Dan has launched. Today's three topics will be Trump's acceptance speech, what he wants to accomplish. Number two, the GOP convention, highlights from the first three nights. And third, what is the role of the traditional conservatives in the Republican Party? For those of you who are new, we'll be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and she'll try to take as many of your questions as possible. So Dan, it's time for me to turn this over to you. Can't wait for all of the discussion.
Kim, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us. A lot going on this week, both at the convention itself and elsewhere. And in fact, I would make the case that the most important thing to happen during the first three nights of the Republican convention, from a political standpoint, did not take place in either Washington, D.C., and has not taken place in Charlotte, North Carolina, but rather in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is a small industrial city in southeast Wisconsin, just outside of my hometown of Milwaukee, where, as all of you know, where 3 nights of protests and demonstrations have taken place, and tragically 2 deaths in the wake of the shooting of an unarmed African-American man. Now, how does this relate politically? Well, while I am confident that this was already in Vice President Pence's speech last night, the key soundbite from Pence's speech was, quote, "Law and order are on the ballot." And as we've talked about on this webinar before, the president and his advisors seem to have realized some time ago, ever since the original demonstrations began taking place in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd last spring, they began to realize the potential key role that issues relating to law and order and public safety could play in the president's reelection effort. And the framing that we heard from Pence last night, and will almost certainly hear from Trump this evening, I think explains a great deal of how the GOP approached their convention and how their strategy will unfold going forward, coming out of the conventions into the home stretch of the general election campaign. Now, first of all, voters have given Trump very poor marks for the way he has handled the racial unrest that the country has experienced since George Floyd's death last spring. But Trump and his team, as I said a moment ago, they believe very strongly that the urban unrest in Portland and Chicago and Kenosha can turn the debate over race relations to his advantage. And tonight, he will almost certainly, while spending most of his time, I'm guessing, going after Biden on the economy, on trade, on China, on any number of other issues, Trump will almost certainly tonight attempt to turn the discussion of police reform into warnings about the potential threat to public safety that demonstrations pose, especially when they turn violent, as they have in Wisconsin and Minneapolis and elsewhere. Now, as we've talked about before, historically, the 2 voter groups that have been most receptive to these types of appeals on law and order and public safety are seniors and suburbanites, precisely the 2 voter groups that Trump has lost the most ground with over the last several months. So more on that later, but let's get to the convention itself and to Trump's speech tonight. So let's start, before we go any further, is I'm going to put a question to all of you. And I'm going to ask you, and Claire, if we can put the first question up. Okay, here we go. Question for all of you to get this conversation started. Is there anything that Donald Trump can say in his speech tonight that would change your likely vote? Now, obviously, there are still 68 days left until the election. A lot more news to happen. We're going to see and hear a lot more from both candidates. But public opinion polls show that most votes are already locked in for one side or the other, and it's becoming a turnout election much more than one of persuasion. So the question for all of you, therefore, is based on what you already know about the president and about his opponent, Vice President Biden. Is there something Trump could say tonight that would either change your vote from supporting him to opposing him, or from opposing him to supporting him? And let's see what the results are, Claire, if we can. All right. Is there anything Donald Trump can say in his speech tonight that would change your likely vote? 4% say yes, 96% say no. And I have to say that response is not surprising, and in all likelihood it reflects, maybe a little bit exaggerated, to what we would see if we asked the entire country that question before tonight's speech. But what we've just established, and I think this is a key thing to understand as you watch the campaign unfold, Trump is not trying to change any minds tonight. I think he would be pleasantly surprised or perhaps displeased, depending on where that 4% is going. But I don't think he'd be particularly bothered by the fact that 96% of the viewing audience, at least this portion of it, would not change their mind in hearing him. Because his job, as Trump sees it, is not to try to change any minds tonight or in the next several weeks, rather to strengthen existing opinions on both sides of the aisle. So those of you who like the president will love his speech. I guarantee it. Those of you who dislike him will be absolutely infuriated. And I'm equally confident in that prediction too. And I know what you're thinking, Jessica, I don't make predictions, but that seems like a pretty safe one. So both intensifying his supporters, the support he gets from his backers, and intensifying the dislike that comes from his opponents, these are the goals that Trump wants to achieve tonight. It's not about changing any minds. It's about motivating his most loyal supporters. Now, the president's obviously still lagging in the polls. As I mentioned a moment ago, he's lost a lot of older voters over his handling of the pandemic, and many suburban voters over the debate that's taken place regarding race relations over the months. And while predicting Trump is always dangerous, it's worth assuming that we're going to hear quite a bit tonight about public safety and law enforcement. We'll also hear quite a bit about China, but that's a topic for another day that I suspect we'll be revisiting pretty regularly between now and Election Day, and for quite a long time afterwards. So let's go on to our second topic, and that's to look back at the first 3 days of the convention highlights. As some of you may know, those of you who saw our emails and our marketing that Claire and her team do, the headline for tonight's program was, quote, "All Trump all the time," unquote. Now, many people contacted me this week when they saw that headline, both Trump opponents and supporters, who thought that the "all Trump all the time" headline was intended as an insult, as a put down to the president. But actually, it was not intended as a pejorative, but rather simply as a comment on the Republican Party's intended strategy for this week's convention, which has been a smart one for achieving the goals that they've identified. And it's worth noting, before we go deeper into that, how different an approach this is, how different a strategy it is than what we saw from the Democrats last week. So if you think back to the Democratic Convention, much to the consternation of many progressives, the Democratic Convention placed a huge priority on reaching out to swing voters in the center of the ideological spectrum. So as I talked about last week, we saw older speakers, we saw several Republican speakers, and with the exception of Bernie Sanders, most of the featured speakers represented a more centrist viewpoint, at least those who appeared in the 1 hour of broadcast television time from 10 to 11 Eastern time, 7 to 8 p.m. Pacific each night. And it became more clear that it already was, even more clear than it already was, that Biden's advisors see his road to the White House veering straight through the upper Midwestern states that Trump stole from under Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. But if the Democrats are all about persuading undecided voters, the Republicans are concentrating almost completely on motivating their most loyal supporters to turn out in greater numbers. And they believe, with some justification given what they accomplished in 2016, that a sufficiently energized core of true believers can turn out in sufficiently high numbers to win the election for Trump without attracting any new backers, any new supporters from the center of the political spectrum as well. And what we've seen to date, and what we'll see again tonight in this week's Republican convention, is an application of that strategy. The first 3 nights of the Republican convention devoted almost no time or interest at all to communicating with voters in the political center. Their speakers were Trump's congressional supporters, his family members, and other cultural warriors talking in very, very aggressive tones about the social and cultural issues that motivate a large portion of the president's base. For 5 years now, the president's unwavering focus has been on his base, on those most loyal conservatives. And he and his team believe that this is a way to succeed this year. Now, can that approach work? It could. The Brookings Institute released a study this week showing that a majority of non-voters in 2016 in the key states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which Trump all carried, a majority of non-voters in those 3 states were white men and white women without college degrees, particularly the white working class demographic that makes up Trump's base. And in fact, the study showed that between 62% and 67% of non-voters in those 3 states who sat out were white voters without college degrees. And so even as Trump has lost support among suburban voters and seniors, increasing turnout with those white working class and rural voters does appear to be his most plausible path. Now, what's important to those voters? What's important to those working class voters, to those rural and small town Americans? Well, these voters are not loyal Republicans, but they do like Trump. There was a Wall Street Journal NBC poll that came out earlier this month. It showed that 49% of Republicans say that their primary loyalty is to Trump over the Republican Party. This is registered Republicans. While 49% say their primary loyalty is to Trump, only 37% say that their loyalty to the GOP comes first. So the strategic thinking that went into this week's convention, given those numbers, is somewhat understandable. The president appearing several times in the first 3 days of the convention, while unprecedented, is giving those voters what they want. All Trump all the time, or at the very least, great quantities of Trump. And not only did we see the president several times, but we saw and heard from Donald Trump Jr., from Eric Trump, from Melania Trump, from Tiffany Trump, and again, of course, lots and lots of Donald Trump. So it may have been unprecedented, and some voters might not have cared for it. But for the Republican base that Trump does need to motivate, it could have been very smart politics. Obviously, there were a lot of speakers not named Trump, all working to excite the Republican base. So whether it was family members or other supporters, that is their goal, not persuasion, but motivation. And given that goal, let's go to the next question, Claire, if you can post it. The question is, who is the most effective speaker of the first 3 nights of the Republican convention? I'm not asking who you liked the most. Given the goal of the party convention of motivating a conservative base, which of the people we've listed below were the most effective at pulling that off, at motivating conservative Republicans? Was it Nikki Haley? Was it Donald Trump Jr.? Was it Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina who gave the keynote for the convention on Monday night? Was it Melania Trump? Or just to check, we want to see what our group is up to. The fifth option, of course, is simply to let us know if you did not watch. So Claire, what do we have for our answers? Okay, so 44% of our audience did not watch. And given that this is a politically savvy and attuned audience, enough to turn into a program like this, that's a pretty high number and suggests to me a lot of minds already made up heading into the convention. But it looks to be a split. Only 6% said Donald Trump Jr. was the most effective speaker at motivating the party base. 13% for Nikki Haley, 18% for Melania Trump, 19% for Tim Scott. Interesting, while the 3 of them, while Haley and Scott and Trump were not really about reaching out to undecided voters, about talking to the political center, the role they played, unlike Donald Trump, was one not just of motivation, but almost of reassurance and trying to remind and comfort portions of the president's base that despite all the terrible things they've heard about him, that he was still okay, and they should feel comfortable supporting him. So quite the split decision there. The third point I want to cover, and then we'll get to your questions, which I'm eager to hear now that both conventions have largely completed, is our third topic is where were the traditional conservatives? And while Haley and Scott, as we just talked about, did get prime speaking roles, they were very much outnumbered in the overall list of those who addressed the convention. It's funny, last week we asked where were the young progressives at the Democratic Convention. This week, the question is not where are the never Trump Republicans, the Kasich and the Romneys of the world. They obviously weren't invited to be there at all. But in addition to the Trump family and staff and the cultural warriors I mentioned earlier, my question is not where were the never Trump Republicans, but where were what we'll call the pre-Trump conservatives, the more traditional members of the Republican Party. We didn't see many, but two who I mentioned earlier, Scott and Haley, received high-profile speaking opportunities on the first night of the convention, as did Donald Trump Jr. And I would suggest to you that even though there weren't a lot of traditional conservatives, there weren't a lot of pre-Trump Republicans addressing the convention, I think what we saw Monday night, I would submit to you, was the first primary of the 2024 Republican presidential campaign. Because you had Tim Scott and Nikki Haley representing a more traditional wing of the party, whereas you also had Donald Trump Jr. speaking on behalf of the current president's most ardent loyalists. Donald Trump Jr., Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, and Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas who's going to be addressing the convention tonight, all represent that Trump wing of the party that we talked about earlier. And if you haven't watched Tom Cotton, and if you do intend to watch the convention tonight, in addition to the president's speech, see what Senator Cotton sounds like. Because a lot of people say he is a much smoother, much calmer version of Trumpism. And for Trump's opponents, that could be a very unnerving prospect. So you've got the Trump wing on one hand, and then you have Republicans like Haley and Scott and Marco Rubio on the other, who are a return to a more traditional conservative attitude and agenda. And regardless of whether Donald Trump wins or is defeated this fall, I think the battle you see for control of the post-Trump Republican Party, whether to continue on this path or whether to revert to a more traditional type of republicanism, is going to be fascinating to watch as time progresses. So Claire, let's see our third and final question and see what our audience thinks. What do you think, or who do you think, is more likely to represent the direction of the Republican Party after Donald Trump leaves office? And whether that's in January of 2021 or in January of 2025, I'm picking out Nikki Haley and Donald Trump Jr. not to suggest that they're the only two people who could lead the party. But as I talked about earlier, they represent two very different wings. Haley is a traditional conservative Republican, Donald Trump Jr. obviously ideologically and by birthright as a Trump Republican. Where do you think the Republican Party is headed? Let's see what people think. Wow, not even close. 54%, more than half of our respondents, think that after Trump, the Republican Party will return to a more traditional type of conservatism, whether given the leadership of Haley or another, we'll call pre-Trump Republican. Only 14% see the party, whether it's under Donald Trump Jr. or Mike Pence or Mike Pompeo, continuing on this path. And a third did not offer an opinion, which is entirely reasonable since the next election is 4 years and 68 days away. Some of you may remember that while I don't like to make predictions, I've mentioned a couple of times in the past, I've speculated at the possible temptation that Trump may have had to remove Pence from the ticket and replace him with someone like Nikki Haley, particularly after Biden first pledged and then fulfilled that pledge in naming a female running mate of his own, Kamala Harris. So obviously that didn't happen. And I'll offer you two thoughts on that. One, although the party has now officially renominated Mike Pence, if at any time over the next 67 and a half days, Donald Trump were to decide that he were in trouble and needed a new running mate, just like he's been more than willing to flout convention in the past, I suspect that while it's unlikely, I wouldn't put it past him, if he felt a change would make sense, to do so and find a way to get the Republican National Committee to confirm his change. But the main reason I don't think that Trump chose to replace Pence is that even though Donald Trump is running behind Joe Biden in the polls, I think he's actually somewhat confident about his standing in this election. According to news reports, he does understand that he's behind. That's something that he denied for quite some time. Over the summer, came to realize that. But it appears that he's beginning to feel somewhat more confident about his reelection prospects than he was earlier in the summer. Now, it's an uphill road for Trump going forward, but he does have some strengths he can build on. Number one, he's doing better in many swing state polls than he was at this point in 2016. While Biden is still ahead of Trump in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and in Florida, Florida is the only one of those four states in which Biden's lead currently is bigger than Hillary Clinton's was at this point in the 2016 campaign. It's worth noting, and we'll hear about it tonight, that the stock market is still strong. But not only is the market doing well, but even though we are a long, long way from being out of the pandemic, it appears that a lot of blue-collar workers in building and plumbing and other manual crafts are doing well too. And that plays right to the president's base. Another consideration is that most polling is susceptible to what's called the social desirability factor, which is respondents telling pollsters what they think they want to hear. And Trump supporters believe, I think usually without much justification, that tends to underestimate Trump's support in public opinion polls. So while I don't necessarily buy into that social desirability factor as it relates to Trump, it is worth noting that the types of racialized issues that are being currently discussed as a result of Minneapolis and now of Kenosha do often make respondents a little bit more hesitant to share their true feelings, particularly the voters who Trump is trying to win back. And then finally, I will note for you that the Biden campaign has outspent Trump's campaign by a fairly large margin, by almost a 2-to-1 margin over the month of August. And the polls really haven't moved. Now, before the Trump opponents in the audience despair, I should reassure you, Biden has a lot of strengths that Clinton didn't. He's viewed more favorably, and he's running much stronger among seniors than Clinton ever was. And that eats into an essential part of Trump's base. Women, both college educated and non-college, have continued moving from Trump throughout the summer. And Trump, the biggest difference between now and 2016 is he has a record to defend. So he doesn't have the outsider status that he was able to use to his advantage last time. So this is, Biden is still in a very advantageous position in this race. But Trump does appear to be more confident, and for the reasons I just mentioned, it appears that he has at least some justification for that confidence. All in all, it's an uphill fight for the president. But heading out of the conventions this weekend, this campaign is far from over. Okay, so with that, Jessica, why don't we see what our audience members are thinking about and what they have to say?
Great, thank you so much. We had one question submitted by a member early. So Professor Schnur, as someone with a center bias, in your opinion, based on nonpartisan assessments and data, what can Trump legitimately claim as actions he has taken that have improved conditions domestically and/or internationally?
Yeah. Well, I'll do my best to answer that question, but I suspect the president will answer the question tonight as an essential part of his acceptance speech. My guess is we'll hear the president point out correctly that until the pandemic hit earlier this year, that the American economy was uncommonly strong. And while there are certainly debates and necessary discussions to be had about income inequality, the overall strength of the economy, not only the stock market, but the unemployment rate, was the issue on which he was planning on running for re-election. And he will almost certainly point to that, saying that if it weren't for this pandemic, Donald Trump, had actually created a very strong economic base for the country. For his base, he will talk about immigration. And he'll make it clear that even though the wall hasn't been completed, that there have been some portions of it built, obviously not a great deal, but that Trump has taken, through executive order and other actions, has taken any number of steps to dramatically limit not just undocumented, but legal immigration into this country. He will talk about the work he has done in the Middle East, moving the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He'll talk about the agreement between the Israelis and United Arab Emirates. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because the president will talk about it tonight and each of you will judge it for yourselves. But I guess the point that I would make to the questioner is that Trump, certainly to his supporters, but even to his detractors, can say, here are things that I have done, and here are things that I believe, and here's why I believe those things have improved the lives of the people of this country. Biden will obviously make a very forceful argument in the other direction, but whether you accept Trump's argument or not, he will have one to make, and we'll see it tonight.
Thank you. We've gotten about 10 questions about the president breaking federal law by having political events in federal venues and the Hatch Act. So if you could comment on that, and hopefully that'll answer a lot of people's questions.
Okay. So as most, if not all of you know, while the president and the vice president are able to campaign on behalf of partisan goals, including their own re-elections, other employees of the federal government are not. And it's fairly clear that in order to hold a portion of this convention at the White House and at federal government property at Fort McHenry, it would have been almost impossible to put this convention on without large numbers of government staff doing campaign work. And certainly the unprecedented role that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, played in the convention. Generally, secretaries of state and secretaries of defense try to stay out of partisan politics. Given the role that acting Secretary of Homeland Security Chad Wolf played in the video that aired Tuesday night of swearing in new citizens as part of the convention activities, there's no shortage of grounds for Democrats and other critics to point out that many members of the Trump administration violated those prohibitions on a number of fronts. There's very little argument on whether or not the Hatch Act was violated. The question is what will the impact of that be? And my own opinion, I say with some regret, is that for many voters, this topic is a fairly abstract one. And I don't know that it's one that will catch the attention of a sufficient number of the voting public for there to be a significant impact, even if ultimately it is decided that federal government employees did violate these prohibitions by campaigning on government time. The House of Representatives has indicated that they intend to hold hearings on this matter. If the Democrats were to retake the Senate in November as well, then a Democratic-controlled Senate would almost certainly bring up the issue as well. But I would say this, is that if Trump is reelected, most of his voters will either ignore or minimize the importance of this topic compared to more issues of direct impact to them, jobs, economic growth, COVID, and so on. And if Trump is defeated, then Congress will almost certainly judge very harshly against him. But by then, he and most of the people who would have violated these prohibitions will have left office. So it's clearly a violation of federal rules, but I don't see it having much of a political impact in the remaining days of the campaign or even beyond.
Thank you. How effective and or persuasive was the RNC versus the DNC?
Well, as I said earlier, the two conventions had different goals. The Democrats were trying very, very hard to persuade undecided voters in the center of the political spectrum, to support them and their candidate as opposed to Trump. And public opinion polls taken immediately after the convention shows that they had some success with that, but not a great deal. And that doesn't suggest that the Democrats didn't run an effective convention. I think they did. But rather, as we saw at the beginning of today's program when I polled you guys on Donald Trump's speech, the country is so polarized and so balkanized and voters are so dug in that there weren't a lot of voters to be persuaded. That said, that was the Democrats' primary goal, and they did achieve it, at least to some degree. But as we talked about earlier, that's not what the Republicans are trying to do this week. They're not trying to persuade anyone. They're trying to motivate their existing base. So in answer to the questioners, in answer to the question, the Democrats did a better job of persuading voters, but it's worth noting because that's what they were trying to do. But the Republican objective was a much different one in motivating their existing base.
Thank you. How does the GOP explain having no platform? Has that ever happened in modern political history?
This is also unprecedented. And one of the things we talk about fairly regularly over the last 4 years is how often this president and this administration have done things that are unprecedented. This is something that neither major political party has done in the modern era, simply deciding they don't need a platform. And I think more than anything else, what it reflects, it goes back to a point that I was making earlier about the nature of the Republican convention, the all Trump all the time approach, is I think what the Republican National Committee and its leaders understood is that the tremendous majority of Donald Trump supporters are not toward a particularly policy agenda. And the voters might support him on issues like trade and immigration and others, but ultimately they're supporting him because he's him. And so if the Republican National Convention were to have approved a convention, would have approved a platform, it would have said something like, we believe in the president, and so we'll support his policy agenda as it moves forward, whatever it may be. And as Trump has remade the Republican Party, whether temporarily or permanently, we talked about that earlier, but as Trump has remade the Republican Party and transformed its feelings on foreign military engagement, on fiscal responsibility, on free trade, and on other issues, a platform from the party might be a bit of a risky proposition, given that if Trump is reelected, there's no way of knowing whether his agenda over the next 4 years would reflect what a platform passed in 2020 would call for. So it is unprecedented, it is unusual, but given that Republicans' loyalty seems to be so much more personally toward Trump than a particular policy agenda, it's understandable.
Thank you. It sounds like this next questioner either did some homework that you suggested, or maybe it's just a very well-read person, but she says, Ezra Klein's Why We Are So Polarized suggests that old-fashioned smoky room party candidate selections led to more moderate candidates than we get today in a variety of elections. Do you concur? If so, should we rethink Democratic primaries?
Well, it's a really good question. And for those of you who weren't watching a few weeks ago when I first talked about it, I mentioned that I'm assigning to my classes this fall, both at USC and at UC Berkeley, 2 books about polarization. One is the book Why We're Polarized, as the questioner noted, from Ezra Klein, the very smart and very progressive journalist. The other book the students will be reading is a book called Them by the conservative Republican Senator Ben Sasse. So we can talk about Klein today. And in his book, as the questioner correctly notes, Klein argues that back when party nominees were picked in private by party bosses, as opposed to by voters, that tended to lead to the nomination of more centrist candidates. And I think that's true not just in the Democratic Party, but in the Republican Party as well. Because what Klein argues in the book, and both Klein and Sass's book are excellent, and I'd recommend them both to you. What Klein argues is because the so-called party bosses in the back rooms understood that in order for their party to succeed, they had to balance several competing interests in the Democratic Party between liberals and progressives on one hand and centrists on the other, and in the Republican Party between cultural conservatives and economic conservatives, and a more broader conservative moderate dichotomy as well, because the party leaders understood the need to appeal to as broad a base of voters as possible in order to succeed. They generally tended to pick candidates with an eye on the general election. And so the most progressive voices in the Democratic Party and the most conservative voices in the Republican Party often got left out in those smoke-filled room discussions, because the majority of party operatives and political professionals knew that their candidate would have to appeal to undecided voters and to voters from the other party. Now, Klein argues that voters make those decisions. And I should say, in fairness to Ezra Klein, he made this argument before Biden became the nominee over Sanders this spring. And we can agree that this year's this unusual set of circumstances for all sorts of reasons. But when Klein points back to several recent Democratic Party primaries, he points out that the passions from progressives and liberals have a much greater impact in a primary system than they would in a private selection process. And I believe that he's right. Now, does that mean that you should get rid of the primaries? I don't think so, not on either the Democratic or the Republican side, because if the majority of voters in a party are principled progressives or principled conservatives, then they deserve to have a say. And if one of the outcomes is that the nominees end up representing the bases of their parties rather than the political center, then that is an accurate reflection of the American voters, even if it does make governance more challenging. So I'm a big one for bipartisan cooperation also, but no question that party primaries make that more difficult. At least in my own mind, that's a trade-off that is necessary.
Thank you. Ignoring the personalities and marketed platforms and ignoring politics, what are the true differences between the Republicans' and Democrats' objectives in the next 4 years?
Wow, I'm not sure we have enough time in the next 22 minutes to go through all of those. But what I would say, I'd raise a couple. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have dramatically different ideas on what represents the best path for the nation's economy going forward. Biden has argued for raising taxes, particularly on wealthy Americans, in order to fund government services that he believes to be essential. Trump, as he argued in 2016, believes that reducing taxes makes more sense and will lead to more economic growth because it'll put more money in the hands and in the pockets of the American people, and then that will lead to more economic growth. There are differences on social and cultural matters are even more dramatic, on abortion rights, on immigration policy, on climate change. The two represent very, very different approaches, even if there are many in the base of Joe Biden's Democratic Party who don't think that Biden is as aggressive as they'd like him to be on those issues. Internationally, to me, this is less of a difference between Republicans and Democrats and more of a difference between Trump and Biden as individuals. Biden, like most leaders both in his party and most leaders in the pre-Trump Republican Party, is very much of an internationalist. Trump, like an increasing number of conservative Republicans, an increasing number of progressive Democrats, tends to want to look more inward and has more isolationistic tendencies and is not as eager to engage in the rest of the world, whether in economic matters or others. There's a much, much longer list of differences between the two, but I would argue that this is probably the most dramatic dichotomy between two major nominees in terms of policy agendas than we've seen in many, many years, possibly going back to the 1984 Reagan-Mondale election, possibly even going back to Nixon and McGovern 1972. The differences are numerous, and I've just barely scratched the surface on them. But I hope that at least begins the conversation.
Maybe that's something we can focus on a little bit every week leading up to November.
Good idea. Very good.
There we go. We'll put it into little bite-sized pieces so we don't overwhelm. Let's see. Sorry, my thing jumped here. Do you not think that the relatively high number of African Americans and women speakers at the RNC is an effort to target those groups and maybe moderates?
For the most part, I don't. There's no question that the Republican Party made a tremendous effort to highlight the voices of female voters and voters from minority communities over the first 3 nights of the convention. And every once in a while, you hear the Trump campaign talking about pulling off even a small percentage of African American votes, and with some justification. If Trump were to increase his support in the African American community from 7 or 8% to 10 or 11%, those votes might be determinative in a state like Michigan or Wisconsin. It's worth noting that the president enjoys support not only nationally, but here in California from just under 1/3 of all Latino and Latina Americans. But I don't think highlighting their presence or the presence of women on the podium was about increasing support from those communities. Rather, as I said earlier, I believe what the convention was attempting to do was to reassure a number of Trump's existing supporters, particularly those who may have wavered over the last few months, and essentially tell them, hey, you've heard all these horrible things about Donald Trump, particularly in this discussion about race relations, but it's okay. They're saying he's not really a racist. Look, he surrounds the convention has a number of faces representing communities of color. And so while it might pull off, that approach might pull off a few votes from these communities, I think it has more to do, it's a message more targeted toward existing supporters than attracting new ones. And with female voters, while there is a very, very large gender gap between the two parties and between the two candidates, perhaps this gender gap in this campaign is at historically large levels with more than a 20-point differential between female support for Trump and for Biden. Trump can't win, even if he doesn't have a majority of female votes, he can't win without any female votes. So in particular, those white working class women, those women who did not attend college, who did support him in large numbers, Trump needs to bring them back. And from hearing from a number of prominent female speakers talking about not just Trump's policy, but his character, is an attempt to reassure them as well.
Thank you. Do we know the ratings of the RNC versus the DNC?
Boy, I believe, and Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that the viewing audiences for the Republican convention have been lower than of the Democratic convention, but not by large numbers. It is worth noting that both conventions have much smaller audiences than they did 4 years ago. There's a couple reasons for that. One is the understandable distraction of a pandemic in some part of race relations in some parts of the country of hurricanes, as we're seeing in Louisiana and Texas right now. But the other reason is that more and more Americans are watching these conventions on their computers or even on their phones rather than on television. And we don't yet have reliable numbers on what the audience size was of those who've chosen to watch the convention through non-traditional means. So the numbers for both parties are down. The Republicans are somewhat lower than Democrats, but we'll see tonight what type of audience Donald Trump draws, because that does tend to be one of his strong suits.
Yeah, the one metric I saw was on night one of the RNC that the online viewing on C-SPAN was 6 times higher watching on Monday night or the first night of the RNC compared to the DNC. So.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Could you please talk a little about how the potential GOP candidates for president in 2024 have helped or hurt their chances by their speeches/visibility this week? Who are the most likely to run? Pence, Haley, Noam, who else?
Boy, I'd say most of the potential candidates probably did themselves more good than harm. Donald Trump Jr., for his goals, and I know our poll of our audience members did not think he was very effective, but for Donald Trump Jr.'s goals, the most loyal, appealing to the most loyal supporters of his father, he was very effective in that regard, much more effective in that regard than either Mike Pence or Mike Pompeo. As I mentioned earlier, I would encourage you, for those of you who are going to watch the convention tonight, to pay particular attention to Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, because it'll be interesting to see how he, representing that Trump wing of the party, how he presents himself. But on that wing, I think Trump Jr. probably was the most effective. For the more traditional Republicans who are thinking about running, I think both Senator Scott from South Carolina and both former Ambassador Haley did very well with their target audience of pre-Trump voters. Governor Noem, I thought, was probably not quite as effective. But the other thing worth noting is that most of those pre-Trump Republicans didn't get to speak at the convention because Donald Trump didn't want them there. So I'm bad enough at predictions 60 days out, so I'm not even going to hazard a guess as to 4 years from now. But I think the names we've talked about are all potential candidates. I suspect, I'll make you this prediction, we will see a primary field for the Republicans 4 years from now that's roughly as large, if not larger, than we saw from the Democrats in 2019 and 2020. In a social media era, the temptation to run for president becomes much, much greater. And at one point, I believe we had well over 24 Democrats seeking their party's nomination late last year and early this year. I think we'll see the same thing from Republicans in 2023 and 2024.
Thank you. We have a number of people asking about the debates and the suggestion that they may not happen or that they shouldn't go forward. Can you share your thoughts on the remarks about canceling the debates and how that could impact the candidates?
I would be very, very surprised if the debates are canceled. Both Trump and Biden have indicated that they intend to debate, and both campaigns have said that they anticipate participating in all three. For those of you who didn't see it, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, made news this morning, and I would admit, at least in my mind, somewhat puzzling news, when she suggested that Biden not debate Donald Trump. And she essentially said, he's not worth it. We shouldn't give him that kind of respect and regard. And while I generally have always been very impressed by Nancy Pelosi's political skills, I'm a little bit confused by this suggestion. If you look at public opinion polls, Biden maintains advantages over Trump in almost every area. One area where Trump still maintains an advantage over Biden in almost every national poll is that he is considered to be a stronger leader than Biden. And I can't imagine what the president and the Trump campaign would do to Joe Biden on the issue of strength if the vice president were to announce that he were not going to debate for any reason. I think it's something that he has to do. My question is, if the debates do end up taking place in person, in other words, if the two of them are on a socially distant stage as opposed to in two different places, my question is, what does Joe Biden do if Donald Trump walks across the stage and compromises Biden's personal space? You remember, Jessica, how discombobulated Hillary Clinton became 4 years ago when Trump began moving around the stage? Well, now in a time of pandemic, it will be a very difficult situation for Biden if Trump comes across the stage to within a 6 foot distance. I do think the debates will take place, though, and I am somewhat surprised by Speaker Pelosi's suggestion this morning.
Thank you. Do you now believe that law and order will become Trump's overriding campaign theme on a going forward basis?
Absolutely. This is where we began the conversation today. The events in Wisconsin have reinforced the importance of these issues to most Americans, the importance of police reform, questions of race relations, and questions of public safety and law and order. And just as Trump moved very, very aggressively in the aftermath of Mr. Floyd's tragic death last spring, I suspect this close to the election, he'll move even more aggressively on these issues in the wake of recent events. And I would suggest to you that perhaps Joe Biden's greatest challenge over the next 68 days is not allowing Trump to paint him as someone who is quote unquote soft on crime or overly sympathetic with violent protesters. How Biden can do that while still articulating a message on behalf of racial reconciliation and police reform isn't an easy path to walk. And Trump, I suspect we'll see it tonight, is going to do everything he can to make it even harder.
Thank you. As a follow-up question to that, someone asked, why hasn't Biden responded to the civil violence and what his response would be to the riots? Trump has responded.
Well, months ago, we talked about how one of Biden's great challenges in the general election campaign would be that as someone who is not currently a sitting office holder, he would have more difficulty attracting attention during the campaign than a president of the United States, a governor of New York or California, or a congressional leader. And that's precisely what's happened here. Biden issued a statement regarding the tragedy earlier in the week. He put out a video yesterday, but both of those statements have been largely lost in the broader conversation. And this will become somewhat easier for Biden once the Republican convention is over, but he has attempted to inject himself into this discussion. And it simply hasn't been heard. Trump, interestingly enough, while he's talked about law and order and public safety, and again, we'll see what happens tonight, has not uttered the name of the young man who perished on Sunday evening. And because he's the president of the United States, anything he says on this issue will get a disproportionate amount of attention. But what Biden is going to have to do, more than written statements and even more than pre-recorded videos, is going to have to take advantage of other online and televised platforms to speak out much more forcefully on this than he has this week. That's not criticizing the substance of what Biden has said, but the very fact that the question was asked means that his role in this is not getting the kind of attention he will need it to, if he wants to have his voice heard.
Thank you. Couple of questions about the postal situation right now. Someone asked, did you watch the hearings with DeJoy concerning the post office? And if so, what is your impression on what is happening with the post office? And just to loop in somebody else's question too, how do you view the potential effects of postal chaos and or outright ballot rejection by biased poll workers?
Okay. So I watched a portion of the hearings and read about them in some depth and detail, as I'm guessing that most of you did also. And I am somewhat, and I emphasize the word somewhat, comforted by the Postmaster General's pledge not to continue these reforms until after the election. And am somewhat comforted by his assertion that the Postal Service has sufficient funds to continue its work through the election and for the ballots to be delivered in the way that we hope they would. Now, that's a matter of huge debate. The Democrats are right to question DeJoy on it because there's been immense confusion over what the post office is doing and what they're not doing. We're going to spend more time on this issue next week, and we'll dig much deeper onto it. But what I'll say today, before getting into the arguments that both sides are making about the Postal Service's capability in a general election, what I will tell you very specifically is my bigger concern is that even if the post office does everything right, even if there are no breakdowns, even if there are no delays, this will still be the largest mail election in the history of this country. And it's an open question as to whether not just the post office, but to whether our vote counters in local and county offices around the country are capable of handling that kind of influx. Over a longer term, they almost certainly will be. Over longer term, it's almost certain. Over longer term, it's almost certain that those votes will be counted. My biggest concern, Jessica, is that the American people have become conditioned on election night to receiving election results. And if we don't have election results Tuesday night, November 3rd, or Wednesday or Thursday, Friday, it could take days or even weeks before we have those final votes tallied. And I worry greatly about possible panic, possible unrest among supporters of both parties when those results aren't out. And one of the things that the news media and responsible local and state office holders of both parties need to do over the next 60-odd days is to embark upon an unprecedented effort to educate the American people, to help them understand that just because we may not have results on election night, that's not a bad thing. That actually means that the votes are being counted carefully and responsibly. So we will talk. We will talk about how prepared the post office is in days ahead. But at least for today, my point is, even if they are prepared for the influx, there's still a matter of great concern that we need to address.
Yeah, I think you're very right. The communication piece to explain to voters how they can vote, how they're supposed to vote this time around, I think is kind of lacking in my experience at this point.
Okay, Jessica, before we go to the last question, I have to correct something I said because I was thinking both about Jacob Blake and about George Floyd.
Okay.
While Jacob Blake was obviously horribly injured, and it sounds like he may be paralyzed, from this point forward, blessedly he did not perish, and I regret my misspeaking. The point I was trying to make is that the president has not referred to the shooting or to the injury, but as all of you know, Mr. Blake has not passed away, and I'm sorry for that statement.
Well, thank you for our in-house fact checker. I'm assuming I think I know who that might have been.
Yes, I think you're right.
All right, this one is from someone you know, so thanks for your most interesting briefings. It would seem that the DNC focused on domestic issues with very low attention to international issues, whereas the RNC is increasing focus on international issues, China, the Middle East, etc. Would you agree? Is one of them mistaken? And it says, thanks, Hillel Newman, Consul General of Israel.
Okay. Well, it's great to hear from Hillel Newman. He's one of the most impressive people I've met in the entire consular corps. He's a wonderful person. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to meet him or hear him, it's something I'd encourage in the future. And his point, not surprisingly, is a very smart one. The Republicans have focused more on international issues, and that's primarily for two reasons. One, they haven't been talking for the most part about the whole world. They've been talking about two countries. They've been talking about China, and they've been talking about Israel. And the Republicans are talking about China to a large degree because of the COVID virus, but also because, as we've talked about in past webinars, the increased antagonism between the two countries and their argument that Trump would be more assertive in confronting China than Joe Biden would be. And the president or the convention is focused to a great deal on Israel because it is an issue that appeals to a great extent to his base, primarily to religious conservative and evangelical Christian voters. And by being able to talk about the convention, about the move of the embassy, and by being able to talk about the agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, it not only gives the Republicans a chance to make a broader point, but to appeal to a very specific portion of their audience. One thing I'd say about the Democrats, and while Hillel is correct, the Democrats focused more on domestic policy than on international matters. What I would say quickly, and perhaps we can talk more about this next week, is the Democrats more than anything seem to have refocused, at least through their convention, to a great deal on Donald Trump's character. And what's interesting is 2 years ago, Democratic congressional candidates spent a lot less time talking about Donald Trump the person and a lot more time talking about policy matters on which they disagreed with him. It's been noted by several observers that this approach, criticizing the president and his conduct in office and his character, is much more similar to the approach that the Clinton campaign took in 2016. Now, of course, the difference is Clinton was not able to convince voters that what she saw as Trump's character flaws would impact their lives. What Biden and his allies argued last week is that the president's personal conduct has impacted American lives, not just on COVID, but on a range of matters over the last four years. But I see we're just about out of time, so maybe that's a conversation we'll save for next week also.
Sounds good. Can I get one more question in, kind of off topic of politics, but still political, I guess?
I'm gonna try.
All right. What are your thoughts on the NBA and MLB response and potential impact on the election?
So as many of you know, I grew up in, and I mentioned at the beginning of this program, I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I've been a lifelong fan of the Milwaukee Bucks since I was a small child. The Bucks won the championship the NBA championship when I was 8 years old. And for those of you who don't know me, you can tell by looking at me that was quite a while ago. So I was thrilled that the Bucks are now competing for the championship. But last night, the team and then several other NBA teams decided not to take the floor and to compete in their playoff games in order to protest, in order to show their concern for the events of the last several days. I think that's commendable. I don't think you have to be a Democrat or a Republican to admire someone with the platform that a professional athlete commands for taking a stand on an issue of importance and principle to them. I don't necessarily agree with what every singer or every actor or every athlete says about matters of the day, but I give them credit for speaking out because they command tremendous audiences. And if there are people thinking about, in this country today, thinking about issues relating to race relations, to police reform, and to public safety that weren't thinking about those issues a few days ago, then the fact that the Bucks and the Orlando Magic and the Lakers and the Clippers and the other teams decided to protest, to skip their games in order to bring attention to these issues, I think that can't help but to be a good thing. And I say as a Bucks fan that I learned just before today's program began that the playoffs will continue after a 2-day respite in order for the players to have their voices heard on these issues. And I hope that once the competition does begin again, that those players and football and baseball and soccer players as well use those platforms to talk about issues that are important to them. Again, you don't have to agree with them in order to admire them for trying to reach a broader audience with important messages.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Apologize.
I'll say this lastly, and yeah. Although I don't like to make predictions, I do predict that my beloved Milwaukee Bucks will defeat either the Los Angeles Lakers or the Clippers in the NBA Finals later this fall. So there.
Got to be careful about saying that here in Los Angeles, but thank you so much. Apologies to all the questions we didn't get. We probably had another 50 to go. So, but thank you so much, Kim. I'll turn the conversation back over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Jessica, we're going to have to get Dan a Go Bucks cup, coffee mug, and in addition to I don't make predictions, you can alternate. Dan, thank you again for a very informative discussion. We learned so much from listening to you each week. Remember, Dan's and all of our live streams are free as a public service. So here's how you can pledge your support. Just text the word Schnur in honor of Dan, SCHNUR, to the number on the screen, and please give what you can. We really appreciate it. It keeps us going, and we really appreciate all your support. Remember, Dan's next week, Thursday, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, and you can register today for a whole list of programs in September and October and beyond at lawac.org, and consider becoming a member. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next week with Dan. Thank you, Dan, again.